The sun was a merciless god in the summer of 1889, raining over a cracked and thirsty land. It baked the color from the sky, leaving a pale, hazy blue stretched tight over the vast, empty prairie. The wind, when it stirred, did little to soothe. It only picked up the fine red dust and spun it into devils that danced across the scorched earth. This dust was the blood of the land, and it coated everything: the brittle blades of buffalo grass, the gnarled arms of the mesquite, and the lonely, winding trail that led to Eli Walker's homestead. The trail was more a memory than a path, a faint scar on the landscape that few men traveled. It ended at a small cabin, rebuilt by hand, standing defiant against the endless horizon. This small patch of earth was all Eli had left, a world carved out of silence and solitude. He had come here not for fortune, but for refuge, a place to bury the ghost of his younger brother, Samuel. The memory of Samuel was as sharp as a shard of broken glass. He saw him in the flicker of the hearth fire, heard his laugh in the cry of a distant hawk. They had worked this land together, their dreams sown into the very soil. But their dreams had been an affront to a man whose ambition knew no borders, Cyrus Rollins, a mining tycoon who saw land not as a home, but as a commodity. The dispute had been swift and brutal. It ended with the original cabin burned to ash, Samuel buried beneath a lone cottonwood tree, and a piece of Eli's soul scorched black. Now, Eli worked the land with a quiet fury. He drove fence posts into the unyielding ground, his movements precise and economical, fueled by a grief that had long since hardened into something else. Resignation, perhaps, or maybe just a deep, abiding mistrust of the world. He had rebuilt the cabin, timber by timber. He had tilled the soil, coaxing a small garden from the reluctant earth. But the man who lived within the sturdy walls was a hollowed-out version of the one who had first laid its foundation. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were always scanning the horizon, not for rain, but for trouble. In this part of the country, they often came hand in hand. His solitude was a fortress, its walls built from routine and silence. Mornings were for mending what the land or the elements had broken. Afternoons were for tending to his few cattle and the horse that was his only trusted companion. Evenings were for sitting on his porch, a rifle across his lap, watching the sun bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple before darkness consumed it all. It was a lonely existence, but it was a predictable one. And after the chaos that had stolen his brother, Eli craved predictability above all else. That predictability was shattered on a night when the sky finally broke. The storm didn't arrive with gentle warning. It tore across the plains like a rampaging beast. Thunder cracked like a whip, and lightning illuminated the world in stark, skeletal flashes. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the red dust to thick, clinging mud. Eli was inside, checking the latch on the window, when he heard it, a sound that did not belong in the symphony of the storm. It was the frantic, desperate beat of horses' hooves, stumbling and erratic, fighting the mud. They grew louder, closer, until they stopped abruptly near his gate. Eli froze, his hand dropping to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. No sane person would be out in a storm like this, which meant whoever was out there was either desperate or dangerous. He didn't much care for either. He moved to the door, peering through a small crack. In the next flash of lightning, he saw a figure, a specter, hunched over a lathered, wild-eyed horse. The figure slid from the saddle, less a dismount and more a fall, and staggered toward his cabin. It was a woman. Her clothes, what he could make of them, were white. A raw, primal instinct screamed at him to bar the door, to let the storm and the prairie swallow her whole. She was trouble. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones, the same way he could feel a change in the weather. But then, she reached the small overhang of his porch and the lamplight from his window fell upon her. She was wearing a wedding dress, or what was left of one. The delicate lace was ripped, the fine silk stained with mud and something darker. Her hair, once likely arranged in an elegant coiffure, was a tangled, wet mess plastered to her face. She took one more step, her hand reaching out as if to knock, but her strength failed her. She crumpled to his doorstep, a heap of ruined white silk, and lay still. For a long moment, Eli remained frozen, the storm raging around him and a different kind of storm brewing within him. He had sworn off the affairs of others. He had built this life to be an island, untouched by the treacherous currents of the world. But to leave her there was to condemn her to death. He thought of Samuel, lying in the dirt, and a bitter curse escaped his lips. He unbarred the door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the inside wall. Rain lashed into the cabin. He paid it no mind. He knelt, his calloused hands hesitating before touching her. She was light, fragile, like a broken bird. He lifted her into his arms, the wet fabric of her dress cold against his skin, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. He laid her on the rag rug before the hearth, the firelight flickering across her pale face. Now, in the steady light, he could see the full extent of her ordeal. An ugly, purple bruise circled her delicate wrist, the imprint of a large, cruel hand. Her cheek was scraped raw, but it was her eyes. When they fluttered open, that struck him the most. They were wide and wild with terror, the eyes of a cornered animal that expects a final, fatal blow. "Water," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper. He said nothing, simply moved to the water barrel and filled a dipper. He knelt and held it to her lips, supporting her head with his other hand. She drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin. When she was done, she sagged back against the floor. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. She shook her head, her eyes darting around the small, sparse cabin, taking in the single cot, the rough-hewn table, the rifle mounted above the fireplace. She looked everywhere but at him. "Please," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the door. "Just for the night. I'll be gone by morning." He saw the lie in her eyes. She had nowhere to go. Still, he nodded. He was a fool. He knew it. But he was a fool who couldn't leave a dog to die in a storm, let alone a woman. He tossed a dry blanket beside her. "The floor by the fire's the best I can offer." She curled into a tight ball beneath the blanket, her back to him, her body trembling, whether from cold or fear. He couldn't tell. Eli didn't return to his cot. He settled into his chair, the rifle laid across his lap once more, and watched the strange, broken bride sleep by his fire as the storm slowly wore itself out. The dawn broke clear and deceptively peaceful. The air was washed clean, and the rising sun made the damp earth glitter. Eli was already up, having not slept a wink. He watched her for a while, in sleep. The terror had receded from her face, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. She looked young, younger than he'd first thought, and a vulnerability emanated from her that made his gut twist. As he moved to stoke the fire, his boot nudged one of hers, which had fallen off during the night. It was a delicate thing of fine leather, not made for riding hard across the prairie. As he picked it up to move it aside, he felt something hard inside. He reached in, and his fingers closed around the smooth, wooden handle of a small knife. It was no bigger than a paring knife, its blade barely 3 inches long, but it was sharp. He stood there, the knife in his palm, the cold weight of it a confirmation of his earlier suspicion. She was running from something terrible, but she was also prepared to do something terrible to stay free. When her eyes finally opened, they found him standing over her, the knife held out in his open hand. Color drained from her face. She scrambled into a sitting position, clutching the blanket to her chest. "What's this for?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She stared at the knife, then at his impassive face. Her lips parted, but no words came out. He saw a flicker of defiance, quickly extinguished by a wave of such deep, bottomless pain that he felt it like a physical blow. She simply lowered her head, her shoulders slumping in defeat. A silent admission of everything and nothing. The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. He didn't ask again. He slipped the knife into his own pocket and turned to make coffee. Later that day, his supplies running low, Eli rode into the nearest town, a dusty collection of buildings optimistically named Prosperity. He left the woman at the cabin with a plate of bread and jerky and a stern warning not to move. He didn't trust her, but he trusted the world outside even less. In the general store, while trading for flour and coffee, he caught snippets of conversation from two old-timers gossiping by the Cracker Barrel. The name they spoke sent a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Rollins. "Heard Cyrus Rollins' boy was supposed to get hitched yesterday," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Big affair. Governor was supposed to be there." "Supposed to?" The other cackled. "Word is, the bride vanished, plucked right out of her room the night before. Left a signed marriage contract and nothing else. Cyrus is fit to be tied. Got men combing every inch of this territory, offering a hefty reward for his missing daughter-in-law." "What's she look like?" "Some city girl from back east. Pretty as a picture, they say. Her family owed Rollins a fortune. This marriage was the payment." Eli paid for his goods, his face a stony mask, and left the store. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. The missing bride of the powerful Rollins family. The bruises, the terror in her eyes, the desperation that made her carry a knife. He rode home under the vast, indifferent sky, the weight of his new knowledge heavy on his shoulders. The trouble he had sensed on the wind last night now had a name, a face, and a very powerful enemy. And it was sleeping in his cabin. When Eli returned, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar landscape seem strange and menacing. He found her awake, sitting by the hearth, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The wild panic in her eyes had subsided, replaced by a brittle, guarded composure that was somehow more unsettling. She watched him enter, her gaze steady, as if she had been preparing for this confrontation. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He dropped the sack of supplies onto the table with a heavy thud. "The whole county is looking for the Rollins bride," he said, his voice as flat and hard as the packed earth floor. "Offering a reward." He expected a denial, a plea, more fear. Instead, a flicker of something he couldn't name. Weariness, perhaps, or grim acceptance, passed across her face. She took a slow, deliberate breath. "My name," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "is Clara." It was a simple statement, but it changed the air in the cabin. She was no longer just a specter in a ruined dress, a nameless harbinger of trouble. She was a person, with a name. "My family," Clara continued, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames, "had dealings with Mr. Rollins, unwise dealings. Were from Philadelphia. My father was a merchant who believed his own luck for too long. He fell into debt, a debt so staggering that Mr. Rollins owned him. He owned our home, our name, everything." She paused, swallowing hard. "Mr. Rollins has a son, Alistair. The marriage was presented as a merger, a tidy solution. For Alistair, it was the acquisition of a wife with a respectable Eastern name. For my father, it was salvation. For me, it was the price of my family's folly." Eli remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He had heard stories like this before, tales of men like Rollins whose wealth was a weapon, crushing everything in its path. "I met Alistair only twice before the wedding preparations began," Clara said, a faint tremor entering her voice. "He had his father's ambition, but none of his cunning. He looked at me not as a person, but as a prized mare, a new entry in his ledger. There was a coldness in his eyes, a collector's gleam. Still, I was resigned to it. I believed it was my duty. Her hands tightened on the blanket. The night before the ceremony, he came to my room. He was celebrating his good fortune with whiskey. He presented me with a stack of documents, legal papers. He said, a formality. They would have signed over my inheritance, what little was left to me from my grandmother. Directly to him, it wasn't about the money. It was about possession, absolute possession. She finally looked at Eli, and in her eyes, he saw the phantom of that night's terror. I refused. For the first time in my life, I said no. His words turned sharp, then ugly. He told me what I was, what he had bought. When I tried to leave the room, his grip was like iron on my wrist. She unconsciously rubbed the bruised flesh. The memory, a raw, living thing. He told me I would learn to obey. He pushed me. My head struck the bedpost. The last thing I saw was his face, twisted in rage, because one of his possessions had dared to show a will of its own. She didn't need to elaborate. Eli could fill in the blanks. The world was full of men like Alistair Rawlins. When I came to, she whispered, the room was empty. I knew then that marrying him wouldn't be a gilded cage. It would be a tomb. So I ran. I took a dress, the only thing of value I could carry, climbed out the window, and stole a horse from the stable. I heard them shouting for me before I even cleared the property line. For 3 days, they were never far behind. I rode until the horse gave out. Then I ran. I didn't eat. I barely slept. The storm, it was a blessing. It covered my tracks. And then I saw your light. Her story ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Eli felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten. His own life had been shattered by Cyrus Rawlins. Now, the man's shadow had fallen across his doorstep once more, wrapped in the guise of this broken woman. Every instinct for self-preservation, honed by years of solitude and grief, screamed at him to cut her loose. "This is Rawlins's business," he said, his voice rough. "It has nothing to do with me." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Rawlins had everything to do with him. He walked to the door and opened it, letting in the cool night air. "When you're strong enough to ride, you'll ride. I'll give you a day's worth of supplies and point you west. Where you go from there is your own concern." Clara struggled to her feet, her face pale with disbelief. "You would just cast me out?" "I'm giving you a chance," he countered, his tone harsh. "That's more than most would do." She took a defiant step toward him, ready to argue, to plead, but the words caught in her throat. A deep, rattling cough seized her, a violent convulsion that shook her entire frame. She doubled over, gasping for breath. Eli moved instinctively to steady her, and when she pulled her hand away from her mouth, he saw it. In the faint lamplight, on her trembling lips, was a fleck of crimson. Blood! The sight cut through his hardened resolve. He had seen enough death to know its harbingers. Lung fever, the cold, the exhaustion. The night spent sleeping in the damp wilderness had settled deep in her chest. To send her out now would be a death sentence. A bitter war raged within him. To help her was to invite the wrath of the one man on earth he truly feared. To turn her away was to be no better than the men who hunted her. He looked at her, frail and gasping, and saw not the Rawlins bride, but a human being pushed to the very edge of existence. He thought of Samuel, and the choice was made. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life, he closed the door. "Get back to the fire," he ordered, his voice gruff to hide the turn of his heart. He guided her back to the rug, his touch surprisingly gentle, and added another log to the flames. The days that followed blurred into a slow, quiet rhythm of survival. Clara's fever rose, plunging her into a delirium where she mumbled names he didn't know and cried out in a fear he could only guess at. Eli became her reluctant caretaker. He brewed bitter teas from willow bark to fight the fever. He made thin broths and patiently spooned them between her lips. He bathed her brow with cool water and sat through long nights, listening to her ragged breathing, the rifle never far from his hand. In her fevered state, her defenses were gone. He saw the girl from Philadelphia, the one who missed her mother and spoke of gardens and books, and he saw the terrified woman who flinched at shadows and whimpered, "Don't let him lock the door." He was tending not just to a sickness of the lungs, but a deeper wound in her soul. As the fever broke and her strength slowly returned, a fragile truce settled between them. The cabin became their entire world, a small, warm island of quiet existence against the vast, hostile prairie outside. Their conversations were sparse, like seeds planted in rocky soil. "You rebuilt this cabin yourself?" she asked one afternoon, her voice still weak. "I did," he replied, mending a leather strap. "It's very sturdy." He just nodded. Another day, she watched him check the horizon from the window. "Are you always expecting trouble?" "Out here," he said, not looking at her. "It's better to expect it than to be surprised by it." The rigid formality between them began to soften, worn down by shared silence and proximity. He learned that her favorite color was the deep blue of twilight. She learned that he preferred his coffee black and strong enough to dissolve a spoon. These were small, inconsequential things, yet they were the first bricks in a bridge being built across the chasm of their mutual mistrust. One evening, nearly a week after her arrival, she was well enough to stand at the wash basin, cleaning the 2 plates from their meager supper. The simple domestic act felt strangely foreign, yet peaceful. In the rugged cabin, Eli stood near the fireplace, cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. He needed a clean rag and turned to get one from a small chest that sat on a shelf just behind her. He moved quietly, but she was still attuned to every sound, every movement. She tensed as he approached. He reached past her for the chest, his mind on his task. For a fraction of a second, as he drew his arm back, the back of his hand brushed against hers in the soapy water. It was nothing, an accident, but a jolt, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. It was a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the dishwater. It was the simple, profound shock of human contact, stripped of all threat and necessity. They both froze. Clara's breath hitched, and a plate slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly in the basin. Eli pulled his hand back as if burned. In the sudden, ringing silence, their eyes met. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the Rollins bride, and she wasn't looking at her grim-faced savior. They were just a man and a woman, caught in a moment of unexpected connection. He cleared his throat and stepped back, retreating to the safety of the fireplace. "Be careful with that," he mumbled, gesturing to the plate. "It's the last one I've got." She gave a small, shaky nod. Her face turned away from him again, but he saw the flush that crept up her neck. The moment was over. The bridge between them now charged with a strange new energy. Later that night, as he lay on his cot, Eli stared into the darkness and acknowledged a dangerous truth. He no longer saw her as just a problem to be solved. He found himself watching the way the firelight caught the stray strands of her hair, the returning strength in the line of her jaw. He felt a protective instinct that went beyond mere decency. With a sinking feeling, he realized that the solitude he had so carefully cultivated for years had been breached. He was beginning to care what happened to Clara. And Clara, though she was healing, remained a captive of her fear. Every day, she would stand at the small window, her body rigid, and stare out at the unchanging horizon. She wasn't admiring the stark beauty of the prairie. She was watching, waiting, her gaze distant and hunted, searching for the dust cloud that would signal the arrival of riders, searching for the moment when her past would finally come to claim her. The wound on Clara's cheek, a raw scrape from her collapse on his doorstep, refused to heal. It remained an angry red, a stubborn physical reminder of her ordeal. Eli watched it for 2 days, his jaw tight, He recognized the telltale signs of a festering infection. The prairie herbs he knew were not enough. There were other plants, stronger ones, but they grew only in the high country, up in the rocky spine of the mountains that clawed at the western sky. He announced their departure at dawn. "The air is thin up there," he said, packing a small satchel with dried meat, a water skin, and a bedroll. "And the nights are cold. You'll need warmer clothes." He offered her a worn buckskin shirt and a pair of Samuel's old trousers. Clara hesitated, her city-bred modesty recoiling at the thought of wearing men's clothing. But one look at Eli's grim, determined face told her this was not a request. She took them, her fingers brushing against the soft, worn leather that had once belonged to the ghost who lived in this cabin with them. The change was transformative. In the ill-fitting clothes, she looked less like a runaway bride and more like a boy. Yet there was a new freedom in her movements, a strength in her stride she hadn't possessed in a restrictive dress. The journey upward was a grueling pilgrimage. The gentle roll of the prairie gave way to a steep, unforgiving incline. The air grew sharp and thin, smelling of pine and cold stone. They walked for hours, Eli leading the way with his steady, ground-eating pace, his horse picking its way carefully behind them. The world opened up, revealing a landscape of breathtaking and brutal beauty. Jagged peaks of granite tore at the clouds, their slopes littered with the skeletons of ancient, lightning-scarred trees. The colors were stark, the deep green of the pines, the cold gray of the rock, the impossible, aching blue of the sky. It was a world of stone and silence, majestic and utterly indifferent to the small, struggling figures moving through it. There was a deadly beauty here, a sense that a single misstep could send a person plunging into eternity. By late afternoon, they were deep in the timberline when Eli suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. Clara froze behind him. He had heard something, a sound that was out of place. It was a low, pained growl, followed by a frantic scrabbling sound. Eli unslung his rifle, his movements fluid and silent. He motioned for her to stay put and crept forward, disappearing into a thicket of aspen. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. She waited, every nerve screaming, until he reappeared and beckoned her forward. In a small, sun-dappled clearing, she saw the source of the sound. A large timber wolf lay on its side, its left foreleg caught in the rusted jaws of an old trap. Its fur was matted with dried blood and dirt, and its golden eyes burned with a defiant, terrified light. It snarled weakly as they approached, its lips pulling back to reveal sharp, white teeth. Eli raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. "Its leg is broken, starving," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Best to put it out of its misery." "No!" The word was torn from Clara's throat. She lunged forward and did something unbelievably reckless. She placed her hand over the cold steel of the rifle barrel, pushing it toward the ground. Eli stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and a flicker of anger. "Get your hand off my rifle, woman. It's a wolf, not a stray dog." "Please," she begged, her voice trembling but firm. "Don't look at its eyes. It isn't ready to die. It wants to live." He looked from her desperate face to the trapped animal. The wolf had stopped growling. It lay panting, its intelligent eyes watching them, seeming to understand the debate being held over its life. Eli saw the wild, untamable spirit in those eyes, the same desperate will to survive he had seen in the woman who now stood before him. He had known hard men, gunmen and ranchers, who would have shot the wolf without a second thought, for sport or for prudence. This woman, who had every reason to fear the world's teeth, had chosen mercy. With a low curse, he lowered the rifle. "Fine," he growled, "but you'll stay back." He approached the wolf slowly, speaking in a low, calm murmur. He worked for long minutes, his powerful hands straining against the rusted metal of the trap until, with a loud crack, the jaws sprang open. The wolf yelped in pain but didn't move to attack. Its leg was mangled, a mess of torn flesh and splintered bone. "It won't survive like that," Eli said, his voice softening slightly. Infection will set in. Clara, ignoring his earlier command, was already at his side. Without a word, she tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat, the last remnant of her old life. While Eli held the animal's head, his hand surprisingly gentle on its neck, she cleaned the wound as best she could with water from their skin. Then, she took the splints Eli fashioned from 2 straight branches and bound the wolf's leg, her movements deft and sure. When they were done, they backed away. The wolf struggled to its feet, favoring its splinted leg. It stood for a long moment, its golden gaze fixed on them, not with aggression, but with a strange, knowing stillness. Then, it turned and melted silently into the deep shadows of the forest. Eli didn't speak for a long time after that. He simply looked at Clara, and in his gaze, something fundamental shifted. He was no longer looking at a fragile girl from the city. He saw a core of courage and compassion that humbled him. The woman who had been afraid of his shadow had faced down a cornered wolf to save its life. In that moment, his grudging sense of responsibility for her began to transform into a deep, burgeoning respect. As dusk began to settle, tinting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, they found shelter in an old hunter's lean-to, a crude, 3-sided structure of logs built against the side of a cliff. Eli built a fire, its cheerful crackle a small rebellion against the encroaching darkness and the profound silence of the mountain. They sat side by side, sharing the last of the dried meat, the firelight playing across their faces, throwing their shadows long and dancing against the rock wall. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer the sharp edge of suspicion, but the humming, vibrant tension of something unspoken, something new and fragile that had been born in the clearing with the wolf. He watched her as she stared into the flames, her expression thoughtful, her face softened by the warm glow. The hardened mask of fear she wore so often had fallen away, revealing a vulnerability that made his chest ache. She must have felt his eyes on her, because she turned to him. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they had not said. "Eli?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her eyes searching his. I'm afraid." "Of Rawlins' men?" he asked, though he knew that wasn't it. She shook her head. "No, not right now. Here, with you, I'm not afraid of them." She took a shaky breath. "I'm afraid because for the first time in a very long time, I feel safe, and I know it cannot last." Her voice broke on the last word. "If you touch me," she confessed, the words so quiet he had to lean in to hear them. "If you touch me now, I don't think I'll ever want to leave." Her confession struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a raw, terrifying admission of trust, a gift he had no right to accept. He looked at her, at the hopeful, fearful light in her eyes, and his own past rose up like a specter. He had wanted things once. He had wanted the land, a future, a life for his brother, and that desire had brought ruin. The world had taught him a brutal lesson. To want something was to invite the world to take it away. To care for this woman, to reach for the solace she offered, was to risk an agony far greater than the lonely peace he had found. He remained silent, his face a mask of stone, and he saw the light in her eyes flicker and die. Replaced by shame, she mistook his internal battle for rejection. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling back, turning her face away. "I shouldn't have—" A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. And that was the thing that broke him. Before she could retreat completely, she hesitated, as if moved by a will of its own. Her body swayed toward his, and she rested her head against his chest, a gesture of utter exhaustion and surrender. Her small hand came to rest on his arm, and he could feel it trembling. That trembling, vulnerable touch shattered his defenses. All the loneliness, all the grief, All the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled to dust. He slowly raised his hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb gently brushing away the tear. Her skin was soft beneath his calloused fingers. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. He had lost everything for wanting something once, but in that moment, looking down at her, he knew he was willing to risk it all again. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of sudden passion, but of slow, deliberate claiming. It was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. And then it deepened as she responded, her hand sliding from his arm to his shoulder, pulling him closer. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was a silent promise in the vast, lonely wilderness, a flicker of warmth against the cold. And for the first time in years, Eli Walker did not feel alone. He woke to the chilling cold of the pre-dawn hour. For a fleeting, peaceful moment, the warmth of the previous night lingered in his mind, a memory of her head on his chest, of a kiss that had thawed a part of him he thought was frozen forever. He turned, a word on his lips, expecting to find her curled beside him under the rough wool of the bedroll. But the space was empty. He sat up, his heart suddenly heavy. She was across the small clearing, her back to him, silhouetted against the pale, gray light that was beginning to bleed over the mountain peaks. She was no longer wearing the buckskin and trousers. She was dressed again in the tattered, mud-stained remnants of her wedding dress. Beside her, folded with a neat, heartbreaking precision, were the clothes he had given her. The act was a statement clearer than any words. It was an ending. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rasp in the quiet air. She flinched, but didn't turn around. "I have to go. Eli!" He was on his feet in an instant, crossing the space between them. He reached for her, his fingers closing around her arm. It felt so thin, so fragile. "Don't stay. We can figure it out." The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He had never been a man for pleading. She finally turned to face him, and he saw that her face was wet with silent tears. Her eyes were full of a terrible, resolute anguish. "Last night," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Last night is why I have to go. Don't you see? I see that you're safer here with me than you are out there alone." A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. "Am I? Or are you in more danger because of me?" She pulled her arm from his grasp, her gaze intense. "These are not reasonable men, Eli. They are not like you. They will hunt me down, and when they find me, they will not just take me back. They will destroy everything I have touched. They will want to make an example of me, and of anyone who helped me." He started to speak, to argue, but she cut him off, her voice rising with desperate urgency. "If they find out you gave me shelter, they will kill you. They will burn this place to the ground and salt the earth so nothing ever grows here again. They did it once, didn't they? For a piece of land." Her words were a surgeon's knife, cutting directly to the heart of his deepest wound, to Samuel. "I will not be the reason they take another thing from you. I will not have your death on my conscience." Her logic was a fortress he could not breach. She was leaving not because she was afraid to stay, but because she was terrified of what would happen to him if she did. It was an act of sacrifice, a selfless, heartbreaking choice that left him utterly disarmed. He could fight Rollins' men, but he could not fight this. He could not fight her determination to save him. He stood there, mute and helpless, as she gave him one last, lingering look, her eyes memorizing his face. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered. Then she turned and walked away, a ghostly figure in white descending the mountain path as the first rays of the sun set the highest peaks on fire. He did not watch her go. He turned his back, unable to bear the sight of it, and stared at the cold ashes of the fire until he was sure she was long gone. When he finally moved, he saw it. Tucked into the folds of the buckskin shirt she had left behind was a small, square piece of fine linen. It was a lady's handkerchief, impossibly delicate and clean, a relic from another world. In one corner, embroidered with painstaking detail in soft, silk thread, was a single, perfect red rose. He picked it up. It was weightless in his rough palm, yet it felt heavier than stone. It was all he had left of her. The journey back down the mountain was a descent into a silence more profound than any he had ever known. When he reached his cabin, it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage of memories, a hollow space that amplified her absence. He saw her everywhere, in the empty space by the fire, in the way the morning light fell on the floor where she had slept, in the tin cup she had used. The bedroll on his cot still held the faint, ghostly scent of her hair, a subtle fragrance of pine and something else, something that was just her. The solitude he had once mistaken for peace now revealed itself as what it truly was, a deep and aching loneliness. Before her, it had been a simple fact of his life. Now, it was a wound. He tried to lose himself in the familiar, back-breaking routine of his life. He mended fences with a vicious energy, split wood until his shoulders screamed, and rode the perimeter of his land until his horse was lathered and spent. But the work brought no relief. His mind was a constant loop of her face, her voice, her touch. The silence was full of her. A few days later, driven by the need for supplies and the even greater need to escape the oppressive quiet, he rode into prosperity. The first thing he saw, nailed to the post outside the general store, was a new notice. Cyrus Rollins had doubled the reward, but it was the wording that made Eli's blood run cold. It no longer spoke of a missing bride. It spoke of a fugitive wife, a deceiver who willfully and maliciously betrayed the sanctity of a marriage contract. The language was cruel and clinical, designed to strip her of all honor and paint her as a treacherous criminal. It was a public declaration of war, not just on her freedom, but on her very character. The town's gossip, which had once held a note of romantic intrigue, had curdled into something ugly. He heard her name spoken in the saloon with a sneer. The story had been twisted. She was no longer a victim, but a calculating, faithless woman who had embarrassed a powerful family. Rollins was not just hunting her. He was poisoning the wells of public opinion, ensuring that no one would dare offer her aid. Another week crawled by, each day longer and emptier than the last. Eli was in the saloon, nursing a single whiskey, when a freight driver, fresh from a run down the West Line, began telling a story to the bartender. "You'll never guess who they caught over at the stagecoach station in Dusty Creek 2 nights back," the driver said, his voice loud and boastful. "That Rollins woman, the one on the posters." Eli's hand tightened around his glass, his knuckles turning white. He strained to listen over the din of the saloon. "Is that so?" the bartender asked. "Sheriff finally earn his keep?" The driver laughed. Sheriff wasn't nowhere near it. It was a couple of Rollins' private men, the kind that don't wear badges. They were waiting for her. She bought a ticket west, and they just stepped out of the shadows. No fuss, no shouting. Just put her in a closed carriage and rode off. Quiet as you please. "Where'd they take her?" someone else asked. The driver shrugged. "Who knows? Not to the county jail, that's for sure. Asked around. No record of her arrest. She just vanished. My guess is old man Rollins is handling this family matter his own way." A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled over Eli. This wasn't justice. This was an abduction. She had been swallowed by the Rollins empire, and the law was turning a blind eye. The next morning, he rode to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Gable, a man whose ambition had long been eroded by laziness and political convenience, was tilted back in his chair, boots on his desk. "Walker," he grunted, not bothering to sit up. "What trouble are you looking to stir up today?" "I heard you caught the woman Rollins is looking for," Eli said, keeping his voice even. Gable's eyes narrowed. He slowly took his feet off the desk. "I didn't catch nobody. And if I had, it'd be on the docket. Now, if you're talking about the private affairs of Mr. Rollins and his wife, I'd say that's a family matter." She was taken at Dusty Creek. Eli pressed. Without a warrant. That's not a family matter. That's kidnapping. Now you listen to me, the sheriff said, his face flushing. You've had your run-in with Rollins before. I suggest you let it lie. This doesn't concern you. The woman is where she belongs. And where is that? Out of my town and out of my jurisdiction. Gable slammed his hand on the desk. Now get out of my office, and Walker, before I find a reason to lock you up for vagrancy. I won't have you causing problems over that traitorous woman. Eli was escorted out by a beefy deputy. The door slammed shut behind him. A final, official seal on Clara's fate. The law had been bought. There would be no help. She was gone. That night, sleep offered no escape. It dragged him down into a suffocating darkness, a nightmare landscape of damp, packed earth and utter blackness. He was in a cellar, a root cellar, or maybe a grave. The air was cold and smelled of rot and despair. And then he saw her. She was standing in the corner of the oppressive dark, but she gave off a faint, pale light. Her beautiful hair had been roughly shorn, and her face was thin and colorless, her eyes like hollowed-out pits of sorrow. She wasn't the vibrant, courageous woman he had held by the fire. She was a ghost, a fading echo. She looked at him, and though her lips didn't move, he heard her voice in his mind, as clear and sharp as breaking glass. Don't let them bury me alive, Eli. He woke with a violent gasp, sitting bolt upright on his cot. The cabin was pitch black, silent save for the frantic beating of his own heart. Her words echoed in the emptiness, not as a memory, but as a plea, a command. Don't let them bury me alive. He finally understood. They hadn't just taken her. They were erasing her, locking her away in some dark, forgotten hole to live out her days in misery. A fate worse than a quick death? The grief and helplessness that had plagued him for weeks burned away, forged in the crucible of his dream into a cold, hard certainty. His hand went to the worn, wooden stock of his rifle, leaning against the wall. He was done waiting. He was done hiding. He was going to get her back. The dream was not a phantom. It was a map. It gave Eli a direction and a purpose that burned hotter than any grief. He packed with the grim efficiency of a soldier preparing for war. His rifle, his Colt, a box of cartridges, a bedroll, and what little food he had, into the pocket of his worn jacket. He tucked the small linen handkerchief with its embroidered rose. It was a promise he intended to keep. He rode west, toward the jagged peaks and the black smudge on the horizon that was the Rollins coal mine. The journey took 2 days, and with every mile, the land grew bleaker, more scarred. He finally arrived in Gritstone, the town that served the mine. It wasn't a town so much as a wound on the landscape. A fine, greasy layer of coal dust coated every surface, turning the buildings a uniform, dismal gray. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and resignation. The faces of the people he passed were gaunt and smudged, their eyes holding the dull, hollowed-out look of those who labored in the dark for another man's fortune. This was Cyrus Rollins' kingdom, built on rock and ambition, and fueled by the lives of men. Eli spent the first day listening, in a saloon where the whiskey was cheap and the despair was free. He nursed a single glass and let the low, grumbling conversations wash over him. He heard talk of cave-ins, of short wages, of Rollins's brutal pit bosses. And then he heard a hushed conversation between 2 miners at the end of the bar. They spoke of a place on the far edge of the Rollins property, a place they called the Nunnery. It was a nickname spoken with a sneer and a shiver. It was, they said, a sanctuary for wayward women, a place where Rollins sent wives, daughters, and sisters who had caused trouble or embarrassment. It was a place people were sent to be forgotten. The dream's chilling words echoed in his mind. Don't let them bury me alive. The next day, he found it, set a mile from the mine, surrounded by a high fence topped with cruel barbs of wire. was a compound. A large, severe-looking main house stood in the center, flanked by a half-dozen small, windowless wooden sheds. It looked less like a nunnery and more like a slave pen. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their rifles held with a casual authority. Eli watched from a ridge all day, his spyglass pressed to his eye, mapping their movements, noting the shift changes, the slow, methodical cruelty of the place. He felt a cold, clean rage settle in his heart. That night, under the sliver of a cold moon, he made his move, dressed in dark clothes. He slipped through the shadows, his movements as silent as a predator's. He found a blind spot in the patrol route and scaled the fence, dropping noiselessly to the ground inside. The air within the compound was stagnant, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and hopelessness. He crept toward the sheds, his hand on the butt of his Colt. He peered through a crack in the first shed. A woman with vacant eyes sat on a straw pallet, rocking back and forth, muttering to herself. In the next, two pale, thin women lay listlessly on the floor. It was a warehouse of broken spirits. And then, in the third shed, he saw her. The sight of her almost made him cry out. The vibrant, courageous woman he had known on the mountain was gone. In her place was a ghost. She was chained to the wall by her ankle, the iron cuff raw against her skin. Her beautiful hair had been brutally hacked off, leaving it in jagged, uneven tufts. Her face was pale and gaunt, marred by a deep, purple bruise on her cheekbone, but it was her eyes that shattered him. They were fixed on the rough wooden wall, but they saw nothing. They were empty, hollow. The light he had seen in them, the fire he had kissed, had been extinguished. She was being buried alive. He forced the primitive lock on the door with the blade of his knife and slipped inside. The shed was cold and damp. He knelt in front of her. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Her head moved slowly, and her empty eyes focused on him. For a moment, there was no recognition. Then, a flicker. Not of hope, not of relief, but of pure, abject terror. "No," she rasped, her voice a dry, cracked thing. "Eli, go now. They will find you. They'll kill you." Even in this broken state, her first instinct was to protect him. "Please," she begged, tears welling in her deadened eyes. "Leave me. You have to." "I'm not leaving you here," he said, his voice low and absolute. It was not a debate. It was a statement of fact. He pulled a small file from his pocket and immediately set to work on the thick iron of her shackle. The rhythmic scrape of metal on metal was the only sound in the shed, a sound of liberation. He worked for what felt like an eternity, his ears straining for the sound of the guards. Finally, with a sharp snap, the iron link broke. He gathered her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a collection of sharp bones and fragile skin. She was too weak to even stand. A storm, which had been threatening all evening, finally broke. Rain began to fall, first as a whisper, then as a roar, turning the dusty compound into a sea of mud. It was the cover he needed. He waited for the guard to pass, his footsteps splashing in the puddles. As the man turned the corner of the shed, Eli struck once, a swift, disabling blow to the back of the head with the butt of his pistol. The guard crumpled without a sound. Then he ran, with Clara cradled in his arms. He fled into the deluge and the chaos of the forest. The rain was a blessing, washing away their tracks, the thunder masking any sound of their escape. He pushed through the darkness, branches tearing at his face and clothes, his boots sinking in the mud, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate, single-minded purpose. Hours later, deep in the woods, he finally allowed himself to stop. He found a shallow overhang of rock that offered some meager protection from the relentless rain. He gently laid Clara down on his bedroll. She was burning with fever, her body trembling uncontrollably. The ordeal, on top of her malnourishment and abuse, had pushed her body past its limits. She began to murmur, her mind lost in a fevered delirium. She wasn't in the forest with him anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark and terrifying from her past. "Mama," she cried, her voice small and childlike. "Don't close the door. Mama, please, not the cellar. It's so dark in the cellar." Her words were a knife in his gut, revealing a layer of old trauma he had never suspected. The fear of being trapped in the dark had been with her long before she ever met Alistair Rawlins. Eli pulled her close, wrapping the blanket and his own body around her, trying to give her his warmth, his strength. He knew he couldn't heal her body with willpower alone, but he could fight the darkness that was trying to claim her mind. He had to keep her anchored to him, to the present. "It's all right, Clara," he whispered, his lips close to her ear, his voice a low, steady rumble against the drumming of the rain. "You're not in the cellar. You're with me." He held her like that all night, as the storm raged and her fever burned. To fill the terrifying silence and to keep his own fear at bay, he began to talk. He told her stories, simple tales from his boyhood with Samuel. He told her about the time they tried to catch a wild colt and were chased into a river. He described the constellations Samuel had taught him, the bear and the hunter, and how they had promised each other they would follow them west one day. He spoke of his mother's kindness, the smell of her baking, sharing pieces of a life he had locked away for years. He was pouring his own memories into her, trying to drive out the nightmares that haunted her. Sometime before dawn, the fever seemed to recede, her trembling eased, and she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, her breathing shallow but even. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the forest was wrapped in a profound, dripping blackness. Eli sat in the dark, holding her, watching the faint outline of her face. She had tried to send him away. She had chosen his life over her own freedom. She might do so again, and in the quiet solitude of the forest, he knew he had to make his own choice, his own promise, one that didn't depend on her. "Clara," he whispered into the darkness, his voice so quiet it was almost a thought. "Even if you don't choose me, I still choose you." Clara woke to a world of green and gray. The oppressive darkness of the shed was gone, replaced by the soft, filtered light of a forest canopy dripping with rain. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, she felt the steady warmth against her back, the solid weight of an arm draped protectively over her. She turned her head, slowly, every muscle aching, and saw Eli. He was asleep, his face etched with an exhaustion so profound it looked like pain. There was a long, angry scratch on his cheek from a branch, and his clothes were torn and muddy. He had the look of a man who had fought a war while she slept, and she knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that he had, for her, the hollow emptiness inside her, the cold void where her spirit had been, was still there, but it was no longer absolute. In its center, a tiny, fragile flame flickered to life. The memory of his voice in the dark, telling her stories, pulling her back from the edge. She lay still for a long time, watching him breathe. When he finally stirred, his eyes opened and found hers. He didn't speak, just watched her, his gaze searching. "You came back," she whispered, her voice a raw, unused thing. "I told you I would," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. The fever was gone, but it had scoured her, leaving her as thin and frail as a winter reed. Yet, as the days passed and they moved slowly and cautiously through the wilderness, something inside her began to knit itself back together. The will to live, which had been so brutally beaten out of her, returned. It returned not as a desperate flight of survival, but as a quiet, steady resolve. She owed this man, who had risked everything, a life worth saving. They traveled north into the foothills of the next mountain range. Leaving Rawlins' territory far behind, they were heading toward a place Eli had heard of, a wild, transient settlement called Broken Ridge, where a new gold strike had drawn men from all over the territory. It was a place of frantic hope and anonymity, a perfect place to disappear. Broken Ridge was less a town and more a chaotic sprawl of tents, crude shacks, and muddy thoroughfares clinging to the side of a mountain. The air rang with the percussive sound of pickaxes striking rock and the constant rush of water through the long wooden sluice boxes. It was a community of rootless men, all chasing a dream, too consumed by their own desperate ambition to pay much mind to a quiet man and his gaunt, weary wife. They found an abandoned tent at the edge of the camp, its canvas patched but serviceable. It became their world. Eli, with his powerful build and tireless work ethic, found a job immediately, not panning for the elusive glitter of gold, but doing the brutal, necessary labor of timbering the unstable mine shafts. It was dangerous, back-breaking work, but it was honest, and it put food on their small, makeshift table. Clara, in turn, found her own purpose. The camp's cook had fled with a week's worth of wages, leaving behind a filthy cook tent and a group of hungry, grumbling miners. Clara, with the quiet authority she didn't know she possessed, took over. She scrubbed the tent clean, organized the meager supplies, and began to cook. Her food was simple: stews, beans. Fresh bread she learned to bake in a cast-iron skillet over the open fire. But it was hot and nourishing. She brought a small measure of order and comfort to the chaotic lives of these rough men. They began to treat her with a gruff, protective respect. She was no longer the Rollins bride or a fugitive. She was Clara, the woman who made the best damn biscuits in the territory. Slowly, tentatively, they began to build a life. Their small tent became a home. Eli built a sturdy frame for a bed and stuffed a mattress with fresh pine boughs that filled the small space with their clean, sharp scent. Clara planted a small patch of wild herbs outside the tent flap and even placed a tin cup of purple mountain asters on their small crate table. They spoke little of the past. It was a locked room, and neither of them had the key or the desire to open it. Instead, they focused on the present. The ache in Eli's shoulders at the end of the day, the price of flour, the prediction of an early winter. In the evenings, they would sit together, the sounds of the raucous camp a distant murmur. Sometimes he would clean his rifle, and she would mend his torn clothes. The quiet domesticity was a balm to both their souls. He found himself watching her, the efficient grace of her movements, the way the lamplight softened the hard lines of her face. The respect he had felt for her on the mountain had deepened into a steady, quiet affection that felt more real than anything he had ever known. And she, in turn, found a profound sense of peace in his presence. His silence was a comfort, his strength a shield. For the first time, she could breathe without fear. One night, the sky opened up. A cold, relentless autumn rain swept through the mountains, turning the camp into a quagmire of mud and misery. The wind howled, threatening to tear their small tent from its moorings. Eli had been called to the mine earlier to help shore up a tunnel that was taking on water. Clara sat by their small stove, listening to the storm, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She heard the sound before she saw anything, a low, deep rumble that vibrated through the very ground, a sound that was not thunder. It was followed by a panicked shout, then another, and another. The camp, usually boisterous, erupted into a new kind of noise, the sound of pure terror. Clara threw a shawl over her head and ran out into the storm. Men were running toward the main mine shaft, their faces pale and slick with rain in the flickering light of their lanterns. "Cave in!" someone yelled. "The west tunnel collapsed!" The west tunnel, Eli's tunnel. The world seemed to tilt and shrink until all that existed was the dark, gaping mouth of the mine and the frantic, disorganized efforts of the men. Clara stood in the rain, frozen, her heart a block of ice in her chest. She watched for what felt like a lifetime as they pulled men out, some walking, some wounded, some limp and lifeless, and then she saw him. Two men were carrying him, his head lolling, his face covered in mud and blood. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. She let out a cry that was swallowed by the wind and ran to him, slipping and sliding in the mud. They carried him to their tent and laid him gently on the pine bough bed. His leg was broken, a clean snap of the tibia. The doctor, a whiskey-soaked old prospector who had once studied medicine, announced after a cursory examination. But it was the gash on his head that was more worrisome. He had been knocked unconscious by a falling beam. The doctor set his leg, binding it with rough splints, gave Clara a bottle of laudanum for the pain, and left. And then they were alone. Just the two of them in the small tent, with the storm raging outside and the sound of Eli's ragged, shallow breathing. Clara knelt by his bed, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She wiped the blood and grime from his face with a wet cloth, her tears mingling with the water. This was her fault, all of it. The ghost of her past had finally caught up and claimed its price. Not from her, but from him. He had found a life of quiet solitude, and she had dragged him from it, leading him here to this cold, muddy tent to be broken in the dark. "I should have left you alone," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and self-loathing. "I should have let you be. This is my fault. You should have let me go." His eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they were focused on her. He slowly, painfully, raised his hand and cupped her cheek. His touch was weak, but it silenced her. "Don't," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Don't ever say that." He took a ragged breath. "Clara, after Samuel died, I wasn't living, I was just waiting for it to be over. You." His thumb brushed away one of her tears. "You are the reason I'm still alive. You're the reason I want to be." His words, spoken so simply, so honestly, shattered the dam of her guilt. He wasn't her victim. He was her partner. He had chosen this, chosen her, every step of the way. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, her sobs softening into quiet, shuddering breaths. She stayed by his side all night, giving him sips of water, checking his fever. As the storm outside began to quiet, so too did the storm inside her. The frenetic energy of their survival, the constant looking over their shoulders, had finally ceased. All that was left was the profound, terrifying, and beautiful truth of their feelings for one another. He woke again near dawn. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the gentle dripping of water from the pines. He looked at her, his eyes clear now, and reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He didn't have to speak. She saw the question, the longing, the love in his gaze. This time, there was no desperation, no fierce claiming against the cold. There was only a slow, gentle unfolding. She leaned in and touched her lips to his, a soft, tentative kiss that was more about comfort than passion. He responded, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, his touch exquisitely tender. In the weak, flickering light of the single oil lamp, they came together. It was a silent vow, an affirmation of everything they had survived. His hands, calloused and strong, trembled as they traced the line of her jaw, her neck, her shoulder. Her touch was a balm on his fevered skin, a whisper of healing. Their breaths mingled in the cool air, a quiet rhythm of two souls finally finding their harbor. It was not the joining of two whole people, but of two broken halves who, in that small, quiet tent, had finally, miraculously, found a way to become whole. For a time, the peace was real. The weeks of late autumn at Broken Ridge were a golden, tranquil season. Eli's leg healed, the bone knitting strong, leaving him with only a slight limp as a souvenir of the mine's fury. He returned to his work, and the rhythm of their life resumed. The harsh edges of Clara's memory began to soften. Color returned to her cheeks, and the haunted, hunted look in her eyes was replaced by a quiet, steady light. Laughter, a sound Eli had not realized he'd missed so dearly, began to echo in their small tent in the evenings. They were not just surviving. They were building something fragile and precious, a life carved out of the wilderness, a home. But happiness in a world like theirs is often a fleeting guest. There was a miner named Silas, a quiet, morose man with a perpetually worried brow. He rarely spoke, but his eyes followed Clara with a strange intensity. One day, as she served him his midday meal, a beam of sunlight caught the side of her face, illuminating the faint, silvery trace of the scar on her cheek, the first mark of her ordeal, from the day she had fallen on Eli's doorstep. Silas froze, a tin plate of stew halfway to his lips. A flicker of recognition, ugly and calculating, passed through his eyes. He had been in Prosperity weeks ago. He had seen the posters. That evening, he approached Clara when Eli was away washing up at the creek. "You're her," he said, his voice a low, accusatory whisper. "The Rawlins woman." Clara's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Silas hissed, his desperation making him bold. "There's a $500 reward. I got a wife and 4 kids back in Ohio counting on me striking it rich. This is my gold strike." She saw the raw, hungry greed in his eyes and knew that pleading was useless. The next morning, Silas was gone. He'd told everyone he was heading to the next valley to check on a new claim. Eli watched him ride out, a familiar, cold knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. 3 days later, 2 men rode into Broken Ridge. They were not miners. They wore city clothes, their boots were polished, and they had the cold, confident eyes of men who were paid to do another man's dirty work. They moved through the camp with quiet purpose, asking questions, their gazes sweeping over everything. Clara saw them from the cook tent, and her entire body went rigid. The fragile piece of the past month shattered like glass. She ran to their tent, her hands already shaking, and began throwing their few possessions into a sack. "They're here," she said, her voice a strained whisper, when Eli entered. "We have to go. Now. We can run south, into the Badlands." Eli stood in the tent opening, blocking her way. He looked at her terrified face, at the frantic movements of her hands. He looked at the bed he had built, at the cup of wilting wildflowers on the crate. He looked at this small, precious life they had pieced together, and in that moment, a profound and unshakable certainty settled over him. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Eli, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his gaze holding hers. "We run now. We run for the rest of our lives. We'll always be looking over our shoulder, always waiting for the next Silas, the next man in a polished pair of boots. Your past will be a ghost that hunts us forever." He took the sack from her trembling hands and set it down. "I'm not running anymore. Clara, we can't run forever." "Then what will we do?" she cried, her voice breaking with despair. "They will take me, and they will kill you for helping me." "No," he said, a grim light entering his eyes. "This time, we hunt the ghost." His plan was insane, audacious, a fool's gambit. He would not meet Rawlins with a gun, but with the one thing a man like him, who operated in the shadows, could not withstand: the light. They would return to Prosperity. They would go back to the heart of his power, and they would use the law against him. The journey back was a return to a bad dream. As they rode into the town, heads turned, and townsfolk stopped to stare, whispering behind their hands. They were no longer anonymous. They were a spectacle. Eli ignored them. His jaw set and led Clara to the one place in town Rawlins didn't own outright: the small, dusty office of Arthur Finch, attorney at law. Finch was a man well past his prime, with a shock of white hair and a face etched with the disappointments of a long, unremarkable career. He was known as an honest man, which was why he was also a poor one. He listened to Eli's request to sue Cyrus Rawlins for unlawful imprisonment with a weary skepticism. "Son," he said, peering at Eli over his spectacles, "you're asking me to fight a dragon with a pea shooter. Cyrus Rawlins is the law in this county. He owns the sheriff. He put the judge on his bench. You don't have a case. You have a death wish." "We have the truth," Eli said simply. Then Arthur Finch looked at Clara. He asked her to tell her story, hesitantly at first, then with a growing strength bolstered by Eli's presence. She spoke. She told him everything, about the forced marriage, the assault, her escape. She told him about the nunnery, the guards, the chains, the other women. As she spoke, the lawyer's weary cynicism began to fade, replaced by a flicker of the righteous fire he must have possessed as a young man. "Other women?" he asked, his voice sharp. "At least half a dozen that I saw," she confirmed. Finch leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. If we could get one of them to speak, just one, then this is no longer a simple domestic dispute. It's a conspiracy. It's a pattern of criminal behavior." The lawsuit was filed. It landed in the small community like a thunderclap. The idea that someone, let alone the haunted Eli Walker and the disgraced Rawlins bride, would dare to formally challenge Cyrus Rawlins was unthinkable. The case became an immediate and massive scandal. The local newspaper, a timid publication that usually reported on church socials and cattle prices, suddenly found its courage and printed the story on the front page. The news spread, and in the dark, forgotten corners of the county, it reached the other women who had been broken in Rawlins' private prison. Most were too terrified to even consider it. But two of them, a widow whose husband's land had been stolen by Rawlins, and a young woman who had been sent away for refusing the advances of a pit boss, came forward. They went to Arthur Finch's office and, with trembling voices, they told their stories. Rawlins, for the first time in his life, was on the defensive. His power was built on fear and shadow, and Eli was dragging him into the open. Public opinion, once so easily swayed against Clara, began to turn. She was no longer a faithless bride. She was a victim, a survivor. Rawlins would not be beaten by a small-town lawyer and a group of hysterical women. If the law would not serve him, he would resort to his own, more direct methods. Eli was walking back from Finch's office one evening, the sky a deep, bruised purple. The street was quiet. He was thinking of Clara, of the courage it had taken for her to face their return to this town. He didn't see the figure detached from the deep shadows of the alley between the saloon and the blacksmith's shop. He only heard the deafening crack of the pistol and felt a white-hot, searing pain tear through his left shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into the dusty street. He lay there, the world tilting, the sound in his ears fading to a dull roar. His last conscious thought was of Clara's face, her name a silent word on his lips. He woke up in the town doctor's small infirmary, his shoulder a universe of throbbing pain. The first thing he saw was Clara, sitting in a chair beside his bed. She was pale, and her eyes were red-rimmed, but she was not crying. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, burned away and replaced by something as cold and hard as steel. The attempt on his life had been the final crucible, forging her will into an unbreakable weapon. She saw his eyes were open and leaned forward, taking his good hand in both of hers. Her touch was firm, steady. "He tried to kill you," she said, her voice low and devoid of any tremor. "Because of me. He tried to silence me. Clara," he corrected, his voice weak. "Because he's afraid of us." "I know," she said, "and I will not be silent anymore." She squeezed his hand. "When the trial begins, I am taking the stand. I will look every man in that courtroom in the eye, and I will tell them everything. Everything Alistair did, everything his father did. I don't care what shame they try to heap on me, what they call me. I will not let them bury you the way they tried to bury me. I will not be afraid anymore." He looked at her, at this incredible woman, forged in fear and fire, now more courageous than any man he had ever known. A wave of love so powerful it eclipsed his physical pain washed over him. He tightened his grip on her hand. "Clara," he said, his voice gaining strength, "if I have to trade everything to keep you, I'm willing." The Prosperity Courthouse was not built for dramas of this scale. It was a simple, wood-frame building designed for settling disputes over stray cattle and punishing drunkards. For 3 days. However, it was the center of the world for 100 souls packed shoulder to shoulder, their bodies creating a stifling heat that smelled of sweat, dust, and nervous anticipation. The air was thick with the weight of one name: Rollins. His power was a palpable presence in the room, felt in the nervous deference of the judge and the swagger of his well-paid lawyer. Eli sat in the front row, his left arm in a sling, a stark, silent accusation. He never took his eyes off Clara. When her name was called, a hush fell over the courtroom. Clara rose, her movements deliberate and calm. She wore a simple, borrowed dress of dark gray wool, her brutally shorn hair softened by a few weeks of growth. There was nothing of the victim in her bearing. As she walked to the witness stand, she held her head high, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, over the jury, and finally, settling on the impassive, stony face of Cyrus Rollins, who sat flanked by his son, Alistair. In that moment, she was not the runaway bride or the fugitive wife. She was justice itself, given a quiet voice and an unbreakable will. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore the oath, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a truth that seemed to shake the very dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Rollins' lawyer, a slick man from the city, began his condescending questions, his tone dripping with false pity, designed to paint her as a hysterical, ungrateful woman. It didn't work. "Mrs. Rollins, though the marriage was, sadly, never consummated," he began with a sneer, "is it not true that my client's family offered you a life of comfort and security?" "They offered me a cage, sir," Clara replied, her voice even. "A gilded one, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. My life was to be the price for my father's debt." For hours, she spoke. The initial whispers and snickers from Rollins' supporters in the crowd slowly died out, replaced by a tense, magnetic silence. She recounted her story not with the melodrama of a victim seeking pity, but with the stark, factual clarity of a witness to a crime. She spoke of Alistair's cold possessiveness, of the documents she refused to sign, of the feel of his hand on her wrist, of the sharp, stunning impact when her head hit the bedpost. Her voice never wavered. Then she spoke of her flight, of the terror and the cold, of stumbling through a storm until she saw a single light in the darkness. Her eyes flickered to Eli, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, unseen by anyone else. The prosecutor, Arthur Finch, then guided her to the events following her capture. "And where did Mr. Rollins' men take you, Miss Thompson?" he asked, deliberately refusing to use her married name. "They took me to a compound near the mine," she said, "a place they called a sanctuary. It was a prison." She described the shed, the chains, the cold, the darkness. She spoke of the other women, her voice dropping as she named them, giving them back the dignity Rollins had tried to strip away. As she spoke, a profound shift occurred in the courtroom. The tide of public opinion, a force as powerful as any river, began to turn. The women in the gallery, wives and daughters of ranchers and shopkeepers, listened with a growing horror and recognition. They saw in Clara's story a dark reflection of their own vulnerability, of the power men held over their lives, their fortunes, their very bodies. The brand of faithless woman was washed away, and in its place, the image of a courageous survivor was forged. The contempt in the room was replaced by a slow-burning anger, a collective sympathy that was more dangerous to Cyrus Rollins than any legal argument. When Rollins' lawyer rose to cross-examine her, his purpose was to break her, to twist her story into a lie. You fled a lawful marriage contract, you stole a horse, you consorted with a man known for his grudge against the Rawlins family. Are these the actions of an innocent woman? Clara met his furious gaze without flinching. They are the actions of a desperate woman, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. A woman who chose the unknown dangers of the wilderness over the certain misery of a life of servitude. A woman who chose to live. Her testimony was the turning point. The two other women who had come forward, emboldened by her strength, took the stand and told their own harrowing stories of Rawlins' private justice. The jury, made up of grim-faced ranchers and merchants, listened, their expressions hardening. This was no longer about a runaway bride. This was about a tyrant who believed he was above the law, a threat to every one of them. The verdict, when it came, was swift, guilty. Cyrus Rawlins was found guilty of unlawful imprisonment and conspiracy. The judgment was staggering. He was forced to pay a massive financial restitution to Clara and the other women. More humiliating for him. The court placed an injunction on his expansion, effectively stripping him of the disputed lands, including the section for which Samuel Walker had died. A roar went up in the courtroom, but Eli and Clara were not there to hear it. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. The prize tainted. Prosperity was not their home. It was a graveyard of bad memories. Their victory was not in the money or the land. It was in the freedom to walk away. They slipped out the back of the courthouse before the final judgment was read, collected their horses from the livery, and rode out of town without a backward glance. They returned to the place where it had all begun, the small, lonely homestead on the edge of the vast prairie. The land was waiting for them, silent and patient. The cabin, which had once been Eli's fortress of solitude, now became their shared project of healing. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. He rechinked the log walls and mended the roof, his shoulders still stiff but his hands sure. She planted a garden, a riot of stubborn, resilient vegetables and wildflowers, coaxing life from the hard, unforgiving soil. They were not just rebuilding a structure, they were building a home, a future, a life. The silence that returned was different now. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the full, peaceful silence of companionship. Some evenings, as the setting sun painted the sky in the hues of orange and deep purple, they would see a lone timber wolf at the edge of the tree line, watching them with intelligent, golden eyes before melting back into the shadows. It was their wolf, the one with the slight limp, a wild, untamable spirit who had found his own way to survive. One such evening, they sat on the porch, a cool breeze whispering through the tall grass. Clara was leaning against Eli, his arm wrapped securely around her, her head resting on his good shoulder. The peace was so complete, so profound, that it felt like a dream. She turned her head slightly, looking up at his strong, weathered profile. "Eli?" she asked softly, the question one she had held in her heart for months. "That morning on the mountain, when I left, if I hadn't gone, would you have kept me?" He was silent for a long moment, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon. A sad, knowing smile touched his lips. He turned his head and looked down at her, his eyes full of a love that was fierce and gentle all at once. "No, Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I wouldn't have kept you." He paused, his thumb gently stroking her arm. "But I would have chased you for the rest of my life." She understood. It was never about possession, about holding her against her will. It was about a choice, freely made, to follow, to protect, to love without condition. It was the most beautiful promise he could have ever made. The story doesn't end there, on that porch. It ends on the trail, with the two of them on horseback, their figures silhouetted against a fiery, blazing sunset. They ride not into a perfect, painless future, but into an open, unknown horizon. Their pasts ride with them, the scars and the sorrows a permanent part of who they are. But they ride together, their shoulders brushing, moving toward a new day. They ride into a life filled with the sharp, aching beauty of freedom. A life redeemed not from pain, but through it. A life brimming with a hard-won, unshakable hope. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So drop a comment below and let's connect. Please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the frontier. And be sure to share your thoughts on Eli and Clara's journey.